Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon and welcome to CSIS. I'm John Alterman, Senior Vice President, Zbigniew Brzezinski Chair on Global Security and Geostrategy, and the Director of the Middle East Program. And I'm delighted to welcome you to a program to mark the publication of a new report, Sustainable States, Environment, Governance, and the Future of the Middle East. Before we get started, I want to thank His Excellency Ambassador Meshal bin Hamad bin Mohammed Al-Thani, the Ambassador of the State of Qatar to the United States, for his support of the project on which the report is based. We're grateful to him for his enthusiasm for the project and for his excitement about the ideas it generated. I also want to thank the project's advisory board of senior experts who advised us on all aspects of the report, as well as the working group of regional experts who brought tremendous field expertise to our deliberations. Finally, I want to thank more than 6 experts in the Middle East whom we interviewed for this project. Their experiments and experiences animated our work and gave us a sense for just how important it could be. The importance of environmentally sustainable public utilities in the Middle East is an improbable topic for a Washington think tank study. Yet, many countries in the Middle East face serious challenges providing utilities in any manner to their populations, and the failure to do so is an increasing flashpoint for public dissatisfaction. This study finds that providing more environmentally sustainable services in the Middle East would be an effective way to address many citizens' grievances that go beyond the mere reliability of the services. It would also help ameliorate dissatisfaction with the quality of governance and help build trust between citizens and their governments. The study examines 3 sectors: power, water, and sanitation and solid waste in Jordan, Lebanon, and Tunisia. While the 3 countries are different in many ways, each faces increasing challenges providing services to their citizens. Providing these services in an environmentally sustainable way would also crucially increase each country's resilience and diminish their vulnerability in a chronically unstable region. The study found that the provision of environmentally sustainable services would have a number of salutary effects. It would provide services economically, it would do so in ways that minimize pollution and conserve vital resources, and it would help empower local authorities that are closely connected to their citizenry. But perhaps more importantly, providing localized environmentally sustainable services would address the yawning trust deficit between millions of citizens and their governments. The halo effect of effective governance would, in the estimation of the study's authors, spread to many other aspects of public life. The topic seems mundane, technical, maybe not worthy of high-level attention, but instead it should be seen as the more persistent ways many citizens in the Middle East see their government. Success in the endeavor would not only preserve the environment for future generations, but also contribute to lasting social peace as well. And to address the issue of peace and security, we could not have a better keynote speaker. General Kenneth F. McKenzie Jr. is the commander of the U.S. Central Command. He has an illustrious resume, and much of what I will leave out is just as impressive of what I include. He was trained as an infantry officer, and he's commanded at the platoon, company, battalion, Marine Expeditionary Unit, and component levels, and his career has led him to a string of senior positions in the field, at the U.S. Central Command, and in the Pentagon. As the commanding officer of the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit, he led the unit on combat deployments to Afghanistan in 2004 and Iraq in 2005-2006. He subsequently served as the military secretary to the 33rd and 34th Commandants of the Marine Corps, on the Joint Staff as Deputy Director of Operations within the National Military Command Center, and in 2008-2009 was Director of the new Administration Transition Team, which was created by the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In June 2009, he reported to the International Security Assistance Force in Kabul, Afghanistan, to serve as the Deputy to the Deputy Chief of Staff for Stability. Upon his return from Afghanistan in July 2010, he was assigned as the Director of Strategy, Plans, and Policy, or the J5, for the U.S. Central Command. In 2014, he assumed command of U.S. Marine Corps forces in Central Command, and a year later was appointed as the director of the J5 Strategic Plans and Policy on the Joint Staff. In July 2017, he was named the director of the Joint Staff. General McKenzie was promoted to his current rank and assumed command of the U.S. Central Command in March 2019. In his current position, General McKenzie has established a reputation as someone who is frank, open, and engaging, and we are delighted to welcome him to CSIS. General McKenzie.
John, thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be invited to CSIS to talk about your recent project on sustainable states. As the combatant commander responsible for the military dimensions of U.S. policy across the Middle East and Central Asia, I must admit that environmental issues don't always feature prominently among my command priorities. That said, I'm also deeply convinced that those issues ought to be prioritized to a higher degree, since failure to account for them or mitigate their effects on the operating environment can negatively impact our mission and can bring additional hardship to local populations. Environmental concerns are often a key driver of conflict because they deal with basic human needs. Water scarcity, in particular, is an area of increasing concern throughout the region and beyond. As an example, one of Egypt's top foreign policy priorities is finding a diplomatic resolution to Ethiopia's filling of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. We call it the JERD for in shorthand in my line of work, but it's on the Nile River, which all of you know, which feeds into neighboring Sudan and Egypt. Egypt characterizes the JERD issue as an existential threat. The Hindu Kush and Himalayan glaciers are quickly melting and could undermine the water supply for 2 billion people living across Central and South Asia. It is certainly not inconceivable that issues like water scarcity could drive a conflict involving 3 nuclear-armed states: Pakistan, India, and China. The problem is acute within U.S. Central Command's area of responsibility. In fact, 12 of the 17 most water-stressed countries in the world are in the CENTCOM region. And while many scholars have researched and debated the relationship between water and conflict, we've already begun to see the impact of water scarcity on local communities in the region. Many of us take for granted access to basic services such as water, sanitation, and electricity. That's not so in much of the world, where a lack of access to these services often gives rise to the underlying frustrations that fuel local instability, governance structures, and also embolden extremist groups that exploit community grievances. Now, I realize that some Americans look at issues like this and are inclined to think, what a pity, I'm sorry, but that's really not our problem. And here's where I think they're ill-informed. We must show leadership in the region, or we can expect instability or for other actors to fill a leadership vacuum. Moreover, the COVID pandemic has reminded us that we live in an increasingly interconnected world where infectious diseases can spread easily across international borders, and they're exacerbated by inadequate water, sanitation, hygiene, and healthcare. China, which still relies on the Gulf for half of its energy supplies, is the most likely contender. It is eager to supplant the United States as the preferred partner in the region and is actively making inroads. China's principal mechanism for doing this is its Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI for short, which offers nations like Lebanon and Tunisia, each featured in your report, the promise of quick and easy infrastructure development at the cost of long-term debt, disregard for sustainability, and eventual entanglement. The fact that neither of these countries are major energy exporters should tell you that China's interests in the Middle East and North Africa extend well beyond oil. Straddling the world's major shipping routes, the region, my region, will remain key terrain in a geostrategic sense long after we've completed the transition to renewable sources of energy. As such, it is one of the principal arenas for strategic competition between two systems with very different values when it comes to fair play in the international system of states and indeed basic human rights. Our commitment to human rights is longstanding U.S. policy. It is the American thing to do, and it's also a priority of President Biden. It's also a sound strategy, one that ensures stability in the region while upholding a rules-based international order on which our way of life depends. If we do not provide a vision of the future based on human dignity and democratic values, China or others will provide an alternative vision. Moreover, the COVID pandemic has reminded us that we live in an increasingly interconnected world where infectious diseases can spread and are exacerbated by conditions that I've already talked about. This is not tomorrow's problem. It's an urgent challenge today, as I'm sure many of the people interviewed for your report would agree. Just how urgent it is should be clear by my presence with you here today. If you've been watching the news, you're aware that my top priority at present is to complete the orderly withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan as safely and swiftly as possible. I also retain responsibility for deterring Iran from undermining the security and stability of the region, and for ensuring that violent extremist organizations were never again capable of launching attacks on the United States or the homelands of our allies. These are tough, demanding tasks that fully occupy my headquarters, but in a certain respect, these are the most straightforward of my missions. I won't say the easiest because they're not, because the stakes are so high. Nonetheless, we know how to use the instrument of military power in tandem with our coalition and interagency partners to accomplish those missions. Far harder to solve are complex environmental, economic, political, and societal problems such as those highlighted in your report. And if you wait till tomorrow to address them, you may well discover that they can no longer be solved. It's become commonplace to state that there is no military solution to problems of this kind. And while that's certainly true, it cannot become an excuse for inaction. During a recent trip to Lebanon, I visited a USAID solar-powered water pumping station and a reservoir in the Bekaa Valley and was briefed on the impact of water shortages on local communities. The visit highlighted the immense efforts undertaken by the U.S. Agency for International Development, engaging with governments and civil society across the region in order to develop sustainable solutions to complex issues. It reinforced what I heard about water programs during visits to Jordan and Pakistan, and also confirmed what I already knew, namely that popular discontent can easily arise when governments are not able to meet a population's basic needs. In today's information environment, malign and opportunistic actors lurk in the digitized shadows of social media to exploit that discontent and radicalize society's youngest members in order to further their agendas to devastating effect in some cases. As far as I'm concerned, this is the nexus really of the security developmental matter. The bottom line is, if we can develop whole of government, or frankly, whole of society approaches with our partners in the Middle East to address these environmental and governance issues, then the likelihood of violent socio-political movements and violent extremism will decrease significantly. When a country is stable politically and economically, it is less likely to exhibit violence and insecurity that would ultimately require military attention. And that's sort of my bottom line. Let me pause here to emphasize the point. I'm not speaking about hypotheticals. I am talking about the hard-won and unmistakable lessons of the past decade. For a generation and more, we have known that we will never truly defeat the scourge of global terrorism until we have addressed the underlying circumstances that cultivate its adherence. Among them are the very conditions your report addresses. And while there are not obvious military means to improve them, their implications for national security are unmistakable. There's probably no clearer manifestation of this problem than the vulnerability of the approximately 60,000 inhabitants of the Al-Hol camp for displaced persons in Syria. This is the largest of dozens of camps, inhabited overwhelmingly by women and children. Many were forced to flee their homes ahead of ISIS violence, and some are the wives and children of ISIS fighters. In the near term, Al-Hol and other camps like it are vulnerable to an outbreak of disease, such as COVID or cholera. But these camps also pose a risk of incubating a toxic ideology that ISIS will use to recruit the next generation of fighters. This is not a military problem to solve, but if ignored, it will become a military problem, just a few years from now. Outside of Al-Hol camp, the nearby communities in northeast Syria regularly suffer from water shortages that have resulted in increasing cases of waterborne illnesses in recent months. The Al-Hol water station in northeast Syria, which serves a population of nearly 500,000 people, has been an increasing source of tension in local communities due to frequent shutoffs, insufficient water to serve the communities, and growing illness due to unsanitary conditions. Recent drought conditions, coupled with a worsening economic crisis, are exacerbating water and sanitation shortfalls and threatening further instability. Thankfully, we are able to depend upon some of our most steadfast allies in the region to not only take responsibility for their own citizens, but also to provide safe havens for those displaced by the destabilizing influences of ISIS and the repressive Assad regime of Syria. In this regard, I'd like to express my gratitude to Lebanon, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and to Turkey for their willingness to host large numbers of refugees from Syria. Unfortunately, their generosity has not made the problem of providing adequate services to their own populations any easier. To the contrary, the compounding effects of refugees, the pandemic, and climate change have produced acute problems for governance that, if not addressed soon, could result in crisis. I've already noted that the absence of a conspicuous military role in addressing these challenges. But this is not always the case, and I'd like to turn my attention for a moment to Lebanon. I was the last there in March, and I saw the firsthand work, the hard work that the Lebanese Armed Forces was doing in assisting the government and managing some of the humanitarian challenges they were facing, ranging from security in the aftermath of the August 2020 Beirut port blast to COVID-19. In U.S. national security jargon, we would call that Defense Support to Civil Authority, or DSCA. It's a crucial function in Lebanon because the country is battling a serious economic crisis and crippling governance issues, and they're inextricably linked. The LAF has demonstrated, or the Lebanese Armed Forces, has demonstrated that it remains a central national linchpin in a governance system that is otherwise fragmented along confessional lines. In that vein, when I last met with the LAF Chief of Staff, General Joseph Aoun, he stressed the importance of U.S. defense and security assistance in providing equipment, education, and training to his force, as well as non-traditional train and equip commodities such as medicine and food, as they work hard to support local authorities during these trying times. Even though Tunisia is outside of my area of responsibility and instead falls under AFRICOM, allow me to make just a couple of comments on that segment of your report. As you noted, Tunisia, the birthplace of the Arab Spring, is the only country in the region to have experienced a full transition of power as a result of the 2011 social movement. Despite that successful transition, long-standing socio-political grievances remain and risk derailing the progress the country has made in the last decade. A data point in your report that caught my eye was the relatively low number of Tunisians paying municipal taxes. I think it was 27%. As far as the governance piece is concerned, that low number illustrates some of the challenges faced by governments trying to implement sustainable programs. The social contract works both ways. In exchange for protection, security, and services provided, populations are expected to pay taxes. In the absences of revenues, governments are unable to uphold their end of the bargain. And that takes us to the issue of trust. The report noted that the Middle East and North Africa as a region experienced a high level of trust deficit. Trust, whether it's relational, organizational, institutional, or political, is a critical factor in the optimal functioning of a government. It provides governments with the legitimacy and breathing space they need in order to harness funds and also technical expertise that they can organize, among other things, to gain them sustainable solutions to complex environmental issues. So, Dr. Alterman, I'd like to close my remarks here by thanking you once again for giving me the opportunity to appear at CSIS to discuss these important issues. To reiterate what I said before, my main aim today was to stress the importance of governance and providing for sustainable solutions for pressing resource issues in the region. If we succeed in this effort, then one would hope that we would find ourselves less militarily involved in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, General, for those very thoughtful remarks. If you have a couple of minutes for questions, among your tours, you were the deputy to the Deputy Chief of Staff for Stability in Afghanistan. As you think back to that experience, was there a time when you felt that restoring public utilities played an outsized role in promoting stability?
So, I'll talk specifically my experience in Afghanistan, where, you have a huge power generation problem. And what, particularly in the South, in Kandahar, I'll pick that as an example, we had a massively expensive project of diesel generators that was just stunningly expensive in order to provide power. The problem was we could never make that into a sustainable solution because the cost was so high. The Afghans were never going to be able to afford it, first of all. And second, and you don't really pay for electricity in Afghanistan. It's a state where there's so many other ways to get electricity, by tapping into a main somewhere illegally or illegally, really doesn't matter. But there's the disorganization of the society was so comprehensive that it was hard to put, an electrical grid across it where you could actually gain revenues for the government, be it from and that would allow them to pursue hydroelectric power. And there are hydroelectric power opportunities in Afghanistan, but they're never able to really connect that to a revenue system, to getting people to pay those taxes. Part of it's cultural. They're not used to doing it in the past. And Afghanistan is certainly not alone in that. But that was one that was driven home to me very, very strongly, how, rural electrification, to borrow a phrase from, I guess, Lenin, is actually something that is very effective in a counterinsurgency campaign. The ability to allow people to have power, because it can do a lot of things for a farmer. It can mechanize farming to some degree. It can also assist in the maintenance of urban areas. It can do a broad number of things. But unless you're able to provide some kind of a virtuous loop there, it's hard to get there. We failed in a lot of things in Afghanistan. I would tell you that I personally had a hand in failing there. And it's one of the things that actually haunts me to this day.
And as you think back to both your time in Afghanistan and also in Iraq, was there a time when politics got deeply embedded in accesses to services in ways that you wish you could have changed?
Sure. Yes. And I think you see that. I think you see that in Iraq today. Where you've got regionalization. Some parts of the country around Baghdad and the east are going to get better treatment than others. The Kurds are a political outlier, so they're going to get less. And that affects distribution of basic services. It also affects in the way income comes into the country. Where's the oil? Where are people sitting on the oil? And Iraq has got to go a long way before they're going to actually bring their oil extraction and exportive capability back. But politics, I think, plays a very direct role in that. And that, you would like to get beyond that. I saw that in Afghanistan. I saw it in Iraq as well. It's unfortunate. It may be that we're never going to get completely rid of it. But if you're going to have a genuine, even if it's going to be a federalized society, people need to actually believe that they're going to get basic human services. Maybe not everybody equally, completely all the time, but I think we're well below that standard in both the countries that I've cited.
So let me pivot, if I can, to the issue of renewables. Military's put a lot of resources into renewables, in part to avoid the need for so many convoys to support military outposts. As a commander in Iraq and Afghanistan, how do you think renewables would have changed or would have made a big difference if you were able to have outposts that were more self-sustaining, if there were more regions of the country that ultimately were more self-sustaining?
Sure, just from a very practical, tactical military observation, it would have saved hundreds of American lives because we had to keep those routes open to move stuff in convoys. As you noted, we were relentlessly attacked in that. If you take that off the table, first of all, fewer Americans are going to die. That's always a good thing. At the same time, you could also apply it to the population writ large. So from a tactical point of view, I think it's very, very useful. From a large, now expanding it to a higher level, I think it would also get at some of the things that we just talked. Renewable energy in particularly is a thing that would solve a lot of problems in Afghanistan. I just cite that as one example. Where we are going to continue to struggle, and I think the struggle is only going to get worse in the next few months as we complete our withdrawal there. But there's a huge role for renewables on the ground militarily, but also in terms of their ability to support a society.
And let me just sort of connect the two streams of thought. If you have renewables, if you have sort of more self-sufficient communities, how do you see that affecting politics? I mean, the broader way politics work, if you don't have the dependencies that current patterns sort of lock you into.
Sure. So the effect would be, I think, and it's just my opinion, you would take that gun away from a political entity that wanted to use it for their, for narrow politically driven reasons. If you're arguing with someone, you can't cut their power off because they generate their own power. That's a lever that you can't apply either in a malign way or in a directly political way.
You see that happen a lot?
Yes. I think that is fairly. Yes, I think that's not uncommon.
And so sustainability or
sustainability gets to that. It gets to that. And, it gets to that at the lowest level, the community level is where you need to begin it. Like, I don't want to oversell it or make it appear rosier than it is, because few things in the Central Command region are actually rosy ever. But I mean, that is an alternative.
Gerald, thank you very much for taking time out of a busy schedule to join us. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for your wisdom and insights, and we look forward to working with you and your team on these issues because I think we all agree they're going to be with us going forward as well.
They are, and again, the reason I took 30 minutes out of a pretty hectic schedule is this is actually an important issue, and your work on it's very good. I'm just glad to be able to say some things, and thanks for having me. I look forward to joining you again at some point to continue the dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, sir.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And if you would stay with us, we have a panel. I can't tell you just how enthusiastic I am about the panel we have lined up for you. It's rare that when you set up to create a panel, you have all of your first choice people, and this is a panel that is all of my first choice people. We'll start with Melani Cammett. She's the Clarence Dillon Professor of International Affairs in the Harvard University Department of Government. and the chair of the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies. She specializes in the politics of development, identity politics in the Middle East. She teaches graduate and undergraduate courses on comparative politics, development, and Middle East politics, and she consults for development policy organizations. She's the author of Compassionate Communalism, about welfare provision and sectarianism in Lebanon, and co-author of the current edition of a classic text, A Political Economy of the Middle East, the first edition of which sits on my bookshelf behind me. Franck Bousquet joined the IMF in March and is the deputy director leading the fund's efforts to strengthen engagement with fragile and conflict-affected states. Prior to joining the IMF, Franck was senior director for the World Bank's Fragility, Conflict, and Violence Group. He led the development of the bank group's first strategy for fragility, conflict, and violence. He has several years of leadership experience working on fragile and conflict-affected states, including significant work on resilience and reconstruction issues in earlier roles as director in the bank's Middle East North Africa region and as a sector manager in Bank of Urban and Social Development sectors in Africa. Prior to joining the bank, Franck held roles in public and private sectors focused on water utilities, transport, and finance and capital markets. Tessa Terpstra is deputy director at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where she helps manage ties with almost 100 embassies and 40 international organizations in the Netherlands. But the reason we have her, and the reason we're lucky to have her, is that in March, she concluded a 5-year tour as the first ever MENA regional envoy for water and energy security for the Dutch Foreign Ministry based in Amman. She's been directly engaged in activities and policy dialogue on resource efficiency and climate change with governments, private sectors, civil society, and donors in the Arab region. So I think what we have assembled is a remarkable array of wisdom that goes from the theoretical to the financial to the practical and applied on the ground, with everybody with experience that overlaps in all those things. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Perhaps, Melani, we'll start with you. You've done a lot of work on service delivery in divided societies. And I wonder if you might talk about how the public utilities that we talk about in our report relate to what you've learned about human services in your work, and also address where does trust fit into this whole thing?
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really honored to be part of this panel and to have had the opportunity to read this important report. Well, I should mention, we'll have to make sure we get the new edition of A Political Economy of the Middle East on your bookshelf soon. So let me just say that, I agree that the focus on these sectoral issues, power, water, sanitation, disposable waste, is unusual for a think tank to undertake, but I could not agree more that it's absolutely vital and that you've put your finger on the most important issues. In fact, when I teach my classes at Harvard, the students are often attracted to issues related to political violence and war and conflict. But the fact of the matter is these issues are the most important issues in the region. And as you rightly point out, not unrelated to conflict and violence as well. And they are certainly the most important issues to people's everyday lives. And so I think they're vital to address. And as you also point out, particularly important in a region that had the greatest level of improvement in social outcomes in the post-World War II era of all global regions. I mean, if you look at the decline in infant mortality, for example, in the Middle East in global comparative perspective since the 1950s until a couple decades ago, it was really the steepest decline, and that's indicative of a broader set of social outcomes. So imagine that this is now a region facing stagnation and profound problems with public service delivery. It's all the more jarring in the context of a history of rapid improvements. The other thing that I think is worth pointing out, and that's also emphasized in this report, is that we now have situations, multiple countries in the region that are in chronic states of conflict, to the point where organizations like the IMF and World Bank have added new categories called conflict states in their reports on the Middle East. And we're doing the same in our new edition of A Political Economy of the Middle East, because you simply can't understand the political economy of the region without looking at the effect of conflict and violence on on economic and social outcomes, not to mention politics. And so it's really refreshing to see this report on these important issues, especially on the question of environmental sustainability, which for some strange reason has received very little scholarly attention in research on the Middle East, and in fact in political science research in general, not just on the Middle East, which I think is gradually starting to change. And I want to say also that I very much appreciate the political economy analysis that is central in the case studies here. So, just to throw out a few examples, the politics of access to water in Jordan, in which the report points out that larger, more well-connected farmers disproportionately have access to water resources while smaller farmers are struggling. Or how informal and formal power sharing along sectarian lines in Lebanon has stymied efficient solutions in favor of arrangements that give stakeholders a cut in the gains of public goods provision. And this, as you referenced, has been a really central theme of my own research. But I think one of the larger issues that I find valuable here is that your report exposes that purely technical solutions are just inadequate. You just cannot fix problems without attention to the politics around resource distribution allocation. Doesn't matter how much human capital and expertise you have, it's not going to work without the attention to the political context. There are some happy stories in this report, which are useful, I think, and valuable. I'm always struggling to give my students happy stories, so I'm definitely going to cite this report and, talk about renewable solar energy provision in this southern Lebanese town in, Fabrica, or some of the other examples. But it's really hard to find these positive examples, and they're qualified as well because they seem to hit these ceilings where it's hard to scale them up or sustain them because of the lack of funds and obstacles from existing stakeholders and so forth. And so even the happy stories hit some, inbuilt limits there. But one thing I want to say that comes through in your report that I think is very critical in both academic and policy research is that we need to pay attention to context. So this is a big debate in academic research. Increasingly, social scientists rely on experimental evidence, on randomized controlled trials as the gold standard for policy analysis and impact assessment. And this approach does a really great job of identifying the causal impact of an intervention or of a program or a policy, but oftentimes does not really pay sufficient attention to the ways in which local contexts affect the way an intervention actually operates on the ground and potentially limits the generalizability of a policy or a program. And so I think, the very detailed sort of local analyses that you bring to the fore are very important here. So I just, in the few minutes I have remaining, want to make a few comments about how this fits with some work I've been doing and some questions I want to raise coming out of this report. So, I think you actually reference a paper that I wrote with my colleague Ishat Diwan and Irina Vartanova in an article that was published in Democratization last year, where we look at people's sense of economic security and also personal safety and security. And we look at how that's correlated with commitment to democracy and trust, and political trust in particular. And we find that, it really tracks closely with a perception of security, and not just at the individual level, at the macro level too. So a sense of whether the country is doing well or not. And so this, is really important because there's lots of debates about whether Arabs and Muslims are committed to democracy, which, I don't put much stock in those debates. I think, our findings and the findings of many other studies show that, that's not the right question to ask. The fact of the matter is people are committed to democracy when they think it delivers for them. And so the case of Tunisia is disturbing because economic security really dropped after the revolution, even as political freedoms opened up. And people are questioning their commitment to democracy. They're wondering, what is this delivering for us? And at a minimum, this shows that that the preference for democracy and political trust are not fixed cultural attributes, but they shift rapidly in the face of perceived insecurity. And this is disturbing for a whole variety of reasons. I've also done a lot of work on the politics of service delivery in Lebanon in particular, and looking at how sectarian actors, political parties, and movements have deployed the provision of welfare goods as part of their political strategies. And in recent work with a graduate student in my department, Aytu Shashmaz, we published a paper looking at the delivery of services by actors that are affiliated with different religious communities. And we find that people think they're getting better services when they go to a provider from their own community. And there's some evidence that they actually do get slightly better services when they go to a provider from their own community. In part, we find a little bit of tentative evidence that this is because the networks of trust are more articulated within the same confessional community. So it's easier to monitor the provider, and the provider feels that they're more accountable. They're going to be held more accountable to members of their own community. So what your report highlights, and what some of my own work has highlighted, is that non-state providers are on the rise, not just in Lebanon, where they've been around for a long time, but across the region, because states are failing to deliver. So we see a lot of NGOs, not to mention the for-profit private sector, which is very much on the rise. The problem is it's out of reach for most people. And this is not necessarily a bad thing, but when you have a welfare regime or public service delivery systems that are dominated by non-state providers, you really need capable states to regulate them to ensure efficiency and equity. And that is not necessarily what's going on in many states in the region. The final thing I want to raise here is it sort of calls into question one of the core arguments that you make in this report, or at least invites further research on this. And so one of the arguments that I think is very inspirational about this report is that, providing sustainable, transparent public services is a way to rebuild trust. And I wonder whether we should be cautious about this claim, and whether we should question if people crave sustainable solutions to public goods provision, at least in the near term. And I'll tell you why I'm wondering about that. First of all, I have a recent project with some co-authors where we did a survey experiment in Lebanon, looking at preferences for political candidates who promise to do different things. And we found that most people really didn't care about programmatic policies. They really cared about access to jobs. Didn't matter if it was through clientelist channels, any channel, they just access to jobs. That was actually more important than sanitation for them and waste management. And you can understand this because this is what people need in their immediate lives, and then they can worry about the larger macroeconomic and structural environment. And the other thing I wanted to ask is that, are the effects of climate change really visible to people? It's sort of a slow boil, climate change. It's not like a dichotomous light switch where suddenly everyone is aware of this. And I think the report even acknowledges this when, in the discussion of the power sector in Tunisia, there's some reference to the fact that entrepreneurs have found it difficult to convince local communities of the benefits of renewables. And so we know that, it's hard for people to see in the longer term, especially when they're in a state of financial economic insecurity. So I think, the report raises important points and potentially plausible arguments about how sustainable solutions can build trust. But I think there's a sort of a missing step in the middle that invites further research about what are the conditions under which people become aware of the benefits of sustainable provision, and how can this be promoted? What are the kinds of interventions that can be done to raise public awareness of the benefits of sustainable public service delivery that will then lead to that final step of more sustainable provision and ideally greater trust in government and non-state providers that are offering these goods in a sustainable way. So this strikes me as an important research frontier that's of interest both to academics and, of course, of vital policy importance as well. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
That's very, very helpful. Thank you. I'm delighted you're interested in context as a trained historian who is not a political scientist. I'm delighted to hear it. Robinson Hall is just down the street from Litauer. It's a quick walk if you wanted to fact. I'm sure they'd be happy to have you. I want to remind our audience that if you would like to ask a question for the panelists for the last part of our program, there's a submit questions button on the streaming webpage. So you should feel free to ask questions. And they pop up on my screen magically, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Franck, you've read the report, you've listened to Melani with a political science perspective and some really, really helpful insights, but you come to this as a banker. How do you think about some of the things we've talked about, and how do you think about banking in societies where the overwhelming thing that's happening isn't economic, it's political? And how do you think about the banking piece, the economic piece, in the midst of profound political insecurity?
Thanks, John. And yes, actually rebounding, not looking at my notes, just listening to the fantastic speech of General McKenzie, but also from Melani, I think the whole point is that you need to cut silos. And definitely, provisions of water services, sanitation, power is not just a technical matter. If you are not, looking at the political economy aspects, if you are not incorporating the drivers of fragility, you are not going actually to address this issue, which is not just about providing water, which is providing in a sustainable manner, financially speaking. Secondly, in an equitable manner, so that you're not going to exacerbate drivers of fragility. You are going also to help building trust. And I agree with the point of Melani. It's also questions of raising awareness. It's not as direct as we may think, but the whole point is about, and I think the report is fantastic in this regard, is actually to show that provision in those three countries of water, sanitation, power is not just a technical issue. This is actually a much bigger game. It's a way of building trust and reaching out to communities and increasing the accountability, potentially, or doing the opposite, of institutions to provide services, which is really the presence of the state at the end of the day. Just stepping back a little bit from the report, which I really enjoy, I think it's a question, and you can see the trend over the past few years, that many international financial institutions have really realized that the importance is not only to bring more financing, but it's also to be much more aware about the issue at stake. For instance, there is no security without development. There's no development without security. You see many important actors that are working in the Sahel in partnership with peacekeeping, with UN, just because if you don't have this space in terms of security, you're not going to provide development services where it's the most needed. You're going to focus in Bangui, you're going to focus of CR, you're going to focus in Bamako, where in fact the whole point is to help states regain legitimacy and build trust where it has been lost for many years. And that's why you can see the emergence of many non-state actors that General McKenzie mentioned. So I think this whole point means what? Means that more and more it's about scaling up support to those countries that are impacted by fragility, conflict, and violence. Is it needed big time? Especially with COVID-19, those countries see significant increase in poverty. They see significant increase in inflation, in debt. They have been the most impacted by the recent pandemic. But it's also a point of not just scaling up financing. It's doing it in a way that is tailored, that takes into account the root cause of fragility, takes into account the political economy, and embrace this whole point about partnership. Now, partnership, you're going to hear it. It's a buzzword. Everybody likes to partner with everybody. The only thing is that in those countries impacted by fragility and conflict, partnership with organizations that have different mandates is essential. Otherwise, it's more a question of providing more financing in area where it's not necessarily always more impactful. Working, for instance, if you look at what has done the some of the IFI, it's actually working with humanitarian actors, so they can be intervening in area where they were not necessarily present in very insecure environment. It's also working with organizations that bring intelligence or knowledge on specific area, UNHCR on the refugee crisis. So I think this whole point about boundaries doesn't make sense anymore when we look at intervening and scaling up support in fragile and conflict-affected states. It's about humility, and it's about recognizing that if you want to have more impact, you will need, exactly like General McKenzie mentioned, address development issue, address drivers of fragility, address grievances before it becomes too late and it becomes a humanitarian or security issue. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much. And Tessa, you don't have the advantage of sitting, well, now you have an advantage of sitting in a beautiful office in The Hague, but you spent a lot of time going out and visiting projects and visiting people who are trying to do things on the ground time after time. What's the piece that's missing that people need to know? You've spent 5 years looking at these kinds of projects, looking at what makes implementation successful and unsuccessful. What do we need to know that we haven't been paying attention to?
Yeah, thanks, John, and thanks for the fascinating discussion and putting together a group of people to discuss your report from different perspectives. I think that's really very helpful and stimulating. Talking about what I see missing, I think the report does a great job to look at context. I think that's incredibly important. And this political economy is very strong in the report, looking at distribution of wealth, resources, power relations, which indeed are very clearly visible on the ground. The fact that the government is unable to enforce or close down illegal wells, for instance, in Jordan, which have been dug by rich farmers, large farmers, who are also part of the of parliament, make it very difficult for governments, and you see this in other countries as well in the region, to actually have an equitable division of resources. So what I would say, what I miss, or where what we've been trying to do as Dutch government with partners in the region, is to actually try to look at the layer in between the larger, more abstract international policy dialogues of the IFIs or research having been done, international donors like my government with large programs, and to actually make that translation to what's happening on the ground. What is that political economy, and which perspectives need to be combined to actually break down those silos. I'll give you an example, and I'll give an example of Jordan because I can pinpoint the different perspectives that need to be taken into account there. So looking at Jordan and the water scarcity in Jordan, they say it's in the top 3 or 4 water scarce countries in the region, and as you rightfully say in your report, it's also the vegetable basket, or at least the Jordan Valley with its hydrocultures of the different heights has a lot of agriculture, and actually the country doesn't have enough water. So what we're trying to do in Jordan is work with one of the water companies, the Yarmouk water company, providing water in the north, and looking how to optimize their wastewater treatment so that it can be reused in agriculture. At the same time, you have to work with the farmers to actually introduce technology that helps them, grow crops that are bring in a lot of income to grow crops with less water. So you combine the water with the hydroponics, but you also need people who are actually able to run as water operators these different wastewater utilities. So we've established a wastewater center for training and education. You also have to work with the government and work with IFIs like Franck and others to help the government set in place the right policies to actually work on taxation and work on a more equitable resource division. You also need data, because you have to know where the water is being used, about the illegal wells, and about the efficiency in agriculture. So you're looking at remote sensing programs. And I think there's a big potential in the region for a younger generation that's actually tech savvy, that really wants to work on these projects. There's quite a lot of startups that are out there in Lebanon with the recycling of waste. The renewable energy has a lot of startups as well. So I think there's a growing ecosystem of people who actually want to tackle these challenges that we see, and that's where the sort of future-oriented job market has a place as well. So I think it's important to really sort of, make the connection between those different layers of what we would like to do as international community, the research that we have, and look on what's happening on the ground. And there's quite a lot going on. And I think I haven't heard yet the whole green recovery, building back better agenda that the international financial institutions have now post-pandemic. And I think there's a big opportunity there to actually try to link local traction, so to speak, of what's happening in a positive sense with the larger financial packages, aid packages that are coming the way of the Middle East.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Again, I'll remind the audience that if you have questions, there's an Ask a Question button on the event page that you're watching the event from. It seems to me, just to pick up on a theme that was common in all of your presentations, there's sort of a level between the central government and international donors and individual consumers, and oftentimes that's a warlord, it's a tribal leader, it's some mediating power authority who relies on the ability to allocate resources as the source of authority. How do we think about that? I mean, is that a group of people we have to co-opt? Is it a group of people we have to suppress? How do we think about that problem? Because there are mediating institutions between a central government, which often can't do it by itself, and individuals who can't get what they need. So, I mean, I think all of you touched on it, and all of you have different insights into it. So I don't want to presume one or another of you should start. I'm interested in what you all have to say. But you're very polite. Melanie?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important point, and there's actually an enormous literature in political science on this mediator across the globe. I mean, in Latin America, there's a ton of research on political brokers who mediate between citizens and political parties, and actually don't necessarily stick to one party in their career. They sort of move depending on the best opportunity with different parties. I know that's the case in Brazil, for example. Tribal chiefs, a lot of people have written about this in sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, we have many different forms of mediators in Middle Eastern contexts. There's what they call the electoral keys in Lebanon and other contexts, who are basically the local actors who deliver the votes. And in some contexts, tribal leaders and so forth. So these are realities of the political terrain. And I don't think they can be suppressed or ignored, because they will simply not make the program or policy get implemented properly if their interests are violated. And they do have leverage in their positions. So the question is, aligning incentives and ensuring that that they're delivering and are being held accountable and so forth, which is going to look different from place to place. So I think it's correct to say there is this category of actor out there that is quite consequential, but they're certainly not going anywhere. And I think they need to be worked, accounted for and incorporated into solutions until there's a totally different type of system in place, which is not easy to just bring about.
Yeah, may I say something about this? I think it really depends on who are the leaders in a community, and trying to work with those who are willing to work with outsiders and can set an example that others can work with as well, to the benefit of others. So working with larger farmers, for instance, if you're talking about food production and water, who are actually able to have a sustainable model of production that others can come and see and have a sort of a demonstration function and can follow up on. So it really depends on, for instance, people installing or making use of renewable energy, and others seeing that this actually works, and who would want to follow. So make use of these people as examples that others want to follow.
Not much to add, I think, on my end, if I may, John. And the local norms, local context, obviously, is extremely important, which also means that we should be very careful of not having a single bullet trying to solve issues of countries or regions that have completely different challenges. And therefore, again, my point about tailoring the assistance, including from international financial institutions, to the specific situation. More and more, you can see that those MDBs, IFI, are now carrying out what we call risk resilient assessment, that are looking at the fragility assessment, which really brings the political economic dimension that Melani mentioned. It was not the case 10 years ago. Why? Because we realized that without factoring this mode of delivery the services, looking at the political economy, not only nationally, but locally, you are going to miss tremendously in terms of the provisions and the financing. So I think this is clearly a trend, and I think we should welcome it. And that also means, again, that was my point, that unless you partner with other organizations that have different skills, different mandates, it's going to be very difficult to have an impact in those situations. Yeah.
But that gets to the point that Melani was making in her presentation, that you sort of embed the current dysfunctional political system and keep things fragile, because the people who are either the electoral keys or the people who are the communal leaders who control resources, and as the general said, deprive people of resources in order to obtain concessions, that in some ways, by reinforcing the layer and co-opting it, rather than trying to use some of these tools to diminish its power, you perpetuate the political environments that perpetuate the economic dysfunction. I mean, there might not be another way to do it, but it seems to me that maybe what I heard, maybe I injected this in what I heard from Tessa, but that there seems to be some opportunities to work directly with communities in ways that minimize and subvert, in some ways, folks who just essentially represent a tax, and empower communities to do things more directly for their own benefit. I mean, is it wrong to hope that it promotes more change?
If I could jump in here. I think your report and other examples in the region suggest one pathway out of this equilibrium, which is, and I'm not saying this is the only way, but it does strike me that there is something potentially powerful when people at the local level organize together and demand accountability from local officials, and there is simultaneously some kind of technical solution like solar power, right, which delivers an alternative mode of energy provision that gives them something to organize around concretely, rather than some abstract principle of accountability, right? And I think this can make changes at the margin. And even though Lebanon is in a really, just incomprehensibly difficult situation right now with, I don't know if we call it a triple or quadruple crisis at this point, but there are also these incredible instances of popular mobilization as well going on. There's, of course, countervailing mobilization. It's complicated. Politics are complicated, and vested stakeholders don't give up easily their privileges, as we can see from what's going on in Lebanon. But I think that is one pathway that it's not clear. You can't predict the future, but it does bring about incremental change. And who knows if that could multiply up and bring about more fundamental systemic change.
Franck, is the...
Yeah, the whole point about those fragility assessment or risk assessment are not precisely to exacerbate the grievances, but actually to address them and build resilience. So the whole point is precisely to better understand the political economy, the distributional impact of specific policies, so that when you're going to push for some reform, you're going to understand who's going to benefit it at the end of the day. And what does that mean in terms of addressing those horizontal or geographical inequalities. So I think the whole point is precisely to have a good understanding about how services are being provided. You cannot obviously copy-paste a model, whether it's centralized or decentralized from one country to another one, but it doesn't mean that you are going to try to just replicate what is going on. You're going to address under the authority at the national, but the local level, some of those grievances as part of the service provision. So I think that's the whole point.
So Tessa, let me ask you a diplomatic question, because governments like to deal with government counterparts. I think host governments like to know what's going on within their borders. And yet a lot of what you did as a donor was work directly with individuals, with communities. How do you see the impetus for being a catalyst for change, with Franck's assessment that you've got to deal with the hand you're dealt, and you have to deal with the power structure that exists? I mean, how did you see that manifesting on the ground? How did you work with it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And of course, I mean, you have to, we can't run the country. We shouldn't. So true. Fair enough. That's a very good point. I think what works best is just show what could work. So provide suggestions, give demonstrations, give expertise, build on questions asked by governments, by government entities. Like, look, we have a problem here. Could you help us solve it? And then we would sort of unravel the whole complexity of what I was saying earlier, that you need to look at education, you need to look at jobs, you need to look at the resources, you need to look at a tax system, you need to look at enforcement data, etc. So it's the whole package that you would discuss with a government, but also say, well, we're the Dutch work with private sector a lot. we like to show governments that actually getting working on a business climate and helping private sector to actually develop is to the benefit of the governments. And ideally, governments would be setting the standards or rules and regulations for private sector to flourish, because that would absorb a job, or work on jobs and absorb people to actually have an income and get these services. So it's I was going to say simply, but of course it's not simply, but this could work. This is something that you could try, and we'll help you set it up. And if you like it, we can scale it up and get the financial institutions to come in and replicate, scale up, looking at local contact. So it's a going back and forth between government entities and the other parts of society that you simply need to get going to be part of this solution, and have governments actually realize that they need these parts of society.
And so let me ask Melani and Franck what I think might be an even harder question, which is how do you maximize the demonstration effects of your successes? I mean, in some ways, I think Tessa can come in and say, we know what works. This model works, and maybe it works in a small place in Jordan, maybe it works in a small place in Lebanon. But in your experience, what makes communities look at other communities and say, I want some of that, and I can do some of that? And you can have the virtuous circle that gets created by something in their own country that has been demonstrated to work. How do you inspire people? How do you get people to make the change to embrace those sorts of things, to catalyze precisely the kinds of changes we're talking about in this report? Franck, why don't you go first?
So it's difficult. I think, they are obviously aligning the incentive. I think it was mentioned, I don't know if it was Tessa or Melani mentioned it, I think it's very important, because at the end of the day, you want to make sure that you have a good enough understanding of the situation today, but also presenting the options if nothing is done. If option A or option B are being favored, here is what's going to happen. That's one aspect. It is really understanding again what are the different options. The whole link with the public awareness, communication, so important. We often skip, I think, this area of focus by just presenting technical solution, not trying to understand what will be the impact on the different stakeholders and who will be winning and losing from reforms or from different investment programs. Sharing knowledge, sharing experience, South-South experience is actually very powerful, because I do believe that in many cases, it's better appreciated, better welcome than trying to impose some model that may not be working at all. And therefore trying to find the relevant experience, whether it's at a community level, local level, regional level, not necessarily national level, that will make the most sense. And having those countries or utilities that have experienced this change, this reform, trying to show what have been their own challenge and why they decided to implement those reforms is extremely powerful, very much more powerful than trying to show a business model that works well in France or the UK or in Denmark. I think having the own local leaders, having the own water utilities managers explaining, in my case, here is what we had to do, here is the discussion we had with the union, here is the impact on price at the end of the day, did we see an improvement of services, what were really the issues that we face, and how did we go about it? This is extremely powerful. When I've been involved in different reforms in Congo and elsewhere, I can tell you that a whole cross-sharing, knowledge exchange with other similar environment is much more powerful than trying just to impose or show a model that may not work at all. So I think it's, trying to first understand the issue, the incentive, who will benefit, going way beyond the technical aspects that of course are crucial, but are probably the most simple aspects of the whole reform agenda, and then trying also again to promote exchange. At the end of the day, it has to be owned, it has to be led, and it has to be decided. by the local, national stakeholders. I think it's important. They are in the driving seat at the end of the day.
Thank you, Melani.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I'm sort of struggling to think of examples or research that's relevant here, but it seems logical that locally relevant examples matter the most, and that's often how diffusion occurs when an actor thinks that an event that occurred elsewhere is relevant to their own circumstance. I think there's multiple levels at which new approaches could be adopted. One could be at the more grassroots level, where community activists learn of and implement or advocate for something they've heard about through other channels. And certainly social media can help with this. People are more and more savvy with social media, and I think that could change the dynamics of local level development as well. And I'm sure it has. It's just that I haven't heard of research on this, but I'm sure that exists. And then, of course, top-down implementation of change, but that runs into the issue of whether there is a national level or provincial level person with authority who has an interest in bringing about change. And often that is not the case for all the reasons you enumerate in this report. It obviously leaders matter, and there are exceptional leaders. I personally have never fully subscribed to the leadership model of development and change, only because I'm quite sure there is a fair distribution of effective leaders in many different communities. The question is, are they able to act on their good intentions, whatever they might be? And so, you can have the most wonderful people that truly are committed to development and equity in their communities, but they may not be able to do anything about it given the existing set of constraints and interests around them. So I do think we ultimately have to think of this interplay between elites and grassroots mobilization to think about how processes of change occur.
Thank you. And there also is this broader problem in social science research of scalability, and how if you have a very good pilot project, how you replicate it partly in different contexts, partly with different leadership in different environments. And that's certainly been confounding, and I think is going to stay confounding, I'm afraid. We have a number of questions. Again, I want to encourage the audience to ask questions if they have them. We have one from Areski Dude from the North Africa Journal, who asks, how can governments facing substantial unrest like Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and others prioritize the concept of sustainability when there's so much public discontent? How do you inject the issue of sustainability when people just want jobs, just want any power now, yesterday? How should we think about that?
Well, by making sure that it's not a goal in itself, but it's going for sustainable jobs. It's going for services that also happen to be sustainable. So it's by turning it around and addressing the needs that are very valid, to have jobs, to have services, to have safety. I mean, if there's a war going on, or people have to flee because of a drought, then it's simply not possible to look at sustainability per se. But if you manage to incorporate it into a solution that they need in any case, then it is possible. So, for instance, people starting to have their own domestic agriculture in refugee camps, for instance, or giving them solar power so they can run a small business. So it's exactly making sure that it's part of the solution to the challenges that they're facing.
So that sounds almost like it's in the donor responsibility to try to promote, to try to ensure that outside assistance is sustainable. And Frank, I'm sure you've thought a lot about that. I'm sure you've also thought a lot about the challenge that if people keep looking to donors for the assistance, you don't actually build domestic wherewithal. You have a reliance on external support. I mean, how does the IMF, how did the bank, when you were leading efforts there, how do you think about that problem of getting the donor in the catalyzing position, but not in the handicapping because people just become dependent on the donor if you're trying to introduce sustainability?
Thank you. I think this is quite important. I mean, that's the whole point of having actually the countries in the driving seat. I think I mentioned it could be obviously at the level of a project, it could be local actors, but for the IFI, it's very important actually to ensure that at the end of the day, they are going to support reforms that are owned, decided, because otherwise this will not be sustainable. And I think we have a number of experience, good and bad, that show that. So I think so it's very important, like you rightly said. I mean, of catalyzing support, of trying to respect the country ownership, and making sure that at the end of the day, you are not going to increase this reliance on external aid, or you are not going to see reforms that are being driven by factors that are not fully owned and decided at a national, local level. Otherwise, you are clearly not promoting sustainability, but you could actually more exacerbate some issue. So I think this is quite important. I mean, that's why you have all the engagement that are looking at country partnership, which, by the way, is not only looking at how it's being led, decided by the national authorities, but also how it is well coordinated between all the actors, so you don't have duplication of efforts. So the whole point about harmonization of aid, cooperation, and ensuring that you have national platforms that are being led by country themselves is actually essential in this regard.
Thank you. We have a question from Christian Knutson from Jacobs about the role of the private sector in this. We've talked a lot about government programs and international financial institutions. What's the role of the private sector in promoting sustainable utilities in your judgment?
I think the private sector is key. What I see in what I've seen in the Middle East, or at least in the countries I've been working in, is that they're actually the drivers of change, much more than the governments. So the government should be, in my view, the enablers, but not the initiators or the runners of sustainability. I mean, if they are, that would be great. But at least to be enablers, to enable the private sector to work on this. And you see this happening in renewable energy, for instance. It's much easier to have a recollection of revenue with electricity than with water, for instance. And waste is difficult because you need a whole chain of supplying enough waste to actually make it cost effective is quite complicated. But in the energy field, it's definitely possible for private sector to thrive.
Thank you. Karim Mugendi, who is a member of our working group, asks about the role of cities, and if there are different answers to these questions, different dynamics in urban environments versus rural environments. I think a lot of us think about a lot of these things on rural scale because it's more approachable. Do cities work differently when it comes to these kinds of services, and do they require different kinds of solutions, or is it just a matter of scale? Melani, you're nodding, so I'm thinking you have an answer.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've been doing some work on the political factors that shape the quality of service delivery in Lebanon, particularly focusing on primary healthcare. And there's definitely distinct rural and urban dynamics, in part because there's more providers and more density of providers in urban areas, so people have more choice. And you see this around election times when you have the discretionary allocation of access to benefits and cash handouts. Some urban areas tend to be more competitive with more efforts to buy votes and so forth, or buy turnout. And so it's a very distinct political dynamic than in rural areas where you have fewer providers. There might only be one provider that's accessible within a certain geographic area. So that alone is one reason why things are different, and then a whole variety of other reasons why urban environments are distinct in terms of meeting your basic needs, and so forth. I mean, it's interesting because usually, we think of mega cities in the global south, and there's huge problems with infrastructure and sanitation and waste and so forth. But in some ways, as your report acknowledges, cities like Beirut, for example, has access to more power per hours per day of power than rural outlying areas. So I think it sort of depends on the sector as well.
And then we have a question from somebody named Shelby at USAID about governments providing economic incentives for more sustainable solutions. How can governments make environmental decisions as economical as possible? Franck, I think that's probably up your alley.
Yeah, I mean, that's coming back a little bit about Tessa. I think a point about every actor has a key role. I think the states has a key role in terms of regulation and providing the right set of policies, pricing in this regard. Just coming back in terms of the rural versus urban, just wanted to, in many cases, the lack of scale is going to have a direct impact on the type of investment and the type of provision of services. Many private sector operators may not be interested to invest because there is no market in a rural area, and therefore it's going to require different type of provisions of services, engaging communities, lower investment. I think the whole point about the scale and the nature of the investment and market is going to have a direct impact, obviously, on the way that the provision, the way the services will be provided. But now the role, I think, of the government looking at the incentive, the way of ensuring that the standards are actually being followed, whether it's about social, environmental standards, is extremely important. And that's going back, I think this has mentioned the point. Every actor has a key role to play. Private sector has a huge role to play in terms of creating jobs. It's not about the SOE or the state to create jobs. It's about the private sector. It has a role to play to bring the technology that is not necessarily available in a specific country. Now, the state has another set of incentive and regulation that is, of course, so important to provide the framework in which private operators can operate.
And Tessa, as you work to get governments on board, what did you find was the most effective argument or most effective instrument to get governments interested in supporting environmental sustainability, and what things had you thought would obviously work and just didn't work in practice?
Yeah, thanks. So what's it works if you can show that there are jobs. I think are jobs in the sustainability sector, green jobs. That's about key, because just as much as there are demands, popular demands, there are also pressures on governments. So showing that jobs work. I would have thought that showing that illegal water use is something to shut down, that would be an easy one, and it turns out to be the toughest to actually do that. And even like the Dutch, we've teamed up with FAO to have a remote sensing program that's really impressive. The whole of Africa and North Africa, Middle East up to Iran, showing water productivity, so the use of water in agriculture. And you'd think that this can be used to see where more water is being used, so they actually can see where illegal wells are. And still, it's very difficult for governments to actually use that information to do something about law enforcement. So that turns out to be really difficult. I wanted to say something about governments. We haven't talked about subsidies. But this is something that's really, really important next to the enabling environment and regulations. Subsidies on energy, fuel, bread, water, because nobody pays the actual price of water, is something that's highly politically sensitive and something that really needs to be worked on. Governments know that. And the more we help, and I think this is something for the IFIs as well, to help countries, governments to actually have social safety nets. So to use a fiscal system, cut down on the subsidies, but have social safety nets for vulnerable parts of the society is something that we really need to look at more, I think.
Thank you. As a final question, we just got one from somebody, Claudia Maria Clem in Germany, who asks whether, this is going to be a question for Franck, whether there's an opportunity to build a more transparent financial system with a completely digital banking system dedicated to sustainability. Should we be thinking about a separate financing mechanism that operates with blockchain that sort of provides things directly? Should we build that infrastructure to promote sustainability? Is that an idea that excites you, or an idea that raises your eyebrows and causes worry?
Well, no, because my worry is in the sense that it goes way beyond my scope of expertise. So unless you are a digital payment expert, I am not. I do believe there is huge potential, obviously, and you can see that many organizations are embracing it. At the same time, you have some safeguards and some cautions to be put in place. Honestly, I'm not going to comment more in the sense that it goes way beyond my focus right now. In terms of digital currency, in terms of leveraging technology, you can also trying to ensure that some countries are leapfrogging and are not actually benefiting from it, even if they are in these situations that we have been covering in terms of fragile and conflict-affected states. But I don't know if some of my colleagues here on the panel are digital payment experts, maybe chiming in for me.
I think the issue was more sort of creating a whole different financing mechanism that would be.
I know. I mean, at the end, I'm not sure where we stand exactly again about the opportunity that is being presented. It will not solve the issue that at the end of the day, those countries that are impacted, as we discussed today, by fragility and conflict, they need significant support. So whether it's about rent, concessional financing, the support has to be provided at a scale which is so significant that it requires cooperation from the whole international community. So I think the means, the methods, that's I think another topics, how we could be further leveraged to help them leapfrog and providing assistance. But I think at the end of the day, it doesn't help. It doesn't solve the issue, which is precisely that. Coming back to the topic of this conference, of this event, that you need many partners that are scaling up their aid, security actors, development actors, international financial institutions, CSO, humanitarian actors, and that cannot just be provided by a single organization. Whether it's about bringing the intelligence on the ground, whether it's about making sure that you have security to provide support, water, energy, whether it's about ensuring that you are going to provide development aid by addressing grievances, all that requires significant support and scale-up support, regardless of the ways it's going to be delivered.
I have learned so much in not only the last 90 minutes, but especially the last 60 minutes. I'm really grateful to Melani and Franck and Tessa for sharing your wisdom, your experience. I'm grateful to you for reading Sustainable States. I encourage you to read it if you haven't. Thanks to General McKenzie and his team for joining us. Thank you for joining us. And on behalf of my co-authors, Natasha Hall, Will Todman, thank you very much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you all again soon. Have a great day. Thanks.
Thank you.